I'm PG, and this is my beautiful wife, Piper. We are starting a series going over the 12 apostles, because ultimately, it's kind of important to know them, because there's a lot of things happen with them, both in Jesus' time and after Jesus' time when they begin to start the church. So it's really important to know some context information about them. Notice I said apostles, or apostles, if you will, because they were more than just disciples. They were actually apostles. Jesus actually had more than 12 disciples. So if you say disciples, while disciples, yes, is a term you could use for them, they were very much following Jesus in a disciple-like manner. They were more than that. They were apostles. And so these are 12 people that you can distinctly say were beyond. And obviously, we have that issue there with Judas, where he kind of loses his apostleship. And you see kind of in Acts where there's another one. And we may get into the quote-unquote 13th apostle, because he was casted lots for, even though we never hear from him like ever again after that point. And we may even get into the quote-unquote 14th, who we actually think may or may not have been the actual person they wanted to replace Judas with. But ultimately, we're going to start with the first 12, the 12 that followed Jesus while he was alive. You could say the first time, I guess. And the OG time. We're just going to go through, this will probably be a 4 or 5 episode series. And in the first episode, we're going to cover 3. And we're going to go pretty much the same pace the entire way through, is doing 3 at a time and trying to keep these somewhat short. We could sit here and tell you all the things these apostles did, but I don't think that's particularly productive. Our biggest goal with you is to try to give you some of the stuff you're not going to read about and the stuff that happened pre-Jesus, especially. So today, we're going to talk about 2 brothers, and then we're going to talk about a tax collector. And so we're going to talk about Simon Peter. And he's kind of what we'll start with. So first off, he and his brother were the first disciples called to follow Jesus. So kind of a pretty cool opportunity for them to be the firsts. Ultimately, this is a interesting experience. Like the actual story is really interesting, because he's calling them from being fishermen. So both of them were fishermen, but they were very different in personalities. So we're getting at Simon Peter first. So you can kind of get into, so when we say Simon Peter, why do we have to say Simon Peter?
So Simon Peter is one of those interesting characters where he actually goes through a biblical name change. So like we talk about Abraham, who used to be Abram, and Sarah, who used to be Sarai. Simon Peter used to be Simon, and then when he meets Jesus, Jesus actually changes his name to Peter, which means the rock.
And then this is, he talks about this again after Peter denies him 3 times and has that whole experience, comes back to Jesus, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me, to feed my sheep, right? That he's ultimately the rock that the church is going to be built on. And you see that he's kind of the forerunner for the church to begin in Acts. Another cool fact about Peter, he was actually married. We get this because we know that he has a mother-in-law. Well, how do you get a mother-in-law? You have to be married. And so he's a really interesting disciple to look at, because he's I think he's the only one that ends up having to really balance this idea of caring for his family. Like, he has that responsibility while also having the responsibility of having to follow Jesus. And that was a completely new experience for him. And so that's a crazy thing to see him handle that. Yeah, it is insane to think about that. He was married and had to do that. And I think it's kind of cool when you realize that and you begin to watch him and his discipleship journey of obviously then going from Simon to Peter and coming from a very hard background. I think fishermen, we need to take a second and kind of explain what fishermen were. You want to provide some context on that?
Yeah. So fishermen were what I would probably compare to like a janitor or like a waste management type of job. Somebody that you know does really dirty work. Like if you are this person's spouse, they are not allowed to touch you or come anywhere near you until they thoroughly shower and wash all of their clothes after they get home from work. Fishermen were dirty. They were smelly. They literally were surrounded by fish all day, every day. And obviously their hygiene practices back then were not up to health code standards in the 21st century. So they were not very popular. They were not people that a lot of people wanted to hang out with. They didn't have a lot of friends other than other fishermen, of course. And so they were kind of out there, kind of on the outskirts of society, not because they didn't work hard, not because they were, ceremonially unclean like some of the other people that Jesus interacts with, but just because the life that they chose to live, their way of making money and income was just kind of gross, and people didn't really care for it.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about. So, kind of a couple other things with fishermen. So, like, we have fishermen obviously nowadays, and it is still considered a pretty dangerous job to be a fisherman and things like that. But you have to understand, in their context, with their technology, what they understood about the seas, what they understood about weather and things like that, it was extremely more dangerous. And so what you have to understand about Peter and anybody else that would have been a fisherman of that time is ultimately they were, one, really like tough people. They were really strong. I mean, the amount of work and manual labor in which they were doing, carrying all these fish, helping move the boats into the waters and take them out and things like that. Like, it was grueling labor. They would have been some of the strongest people. They also would have been decently fed because they would have had all that access to fish and things like that, lots of protein. So, I mean, this is like, gym bro status. Like, all the protein, all the workouts. Like,
all the stink.
Yeah, all the stink. Like, he is jacked. But you also understand that, like, they were fearless. Yeah. And so when you see some of the ways that he ends up interacting, because he definitely has, like, a lot of courage. And it's really interesting when you understand the context of going, okay, yeah, he was a fisherman. And because of that background, I don't want to say that's why Jesus picked him to kind of be the rock that the church was built on, because he was fearless and because he was strong. But it definitely didn't hurt. And it was definitely surely something that he kept in mind when making that decision. Ultimately, Peter's a very passionate person. You can see that very clearly in multiple scenarios and things like that. And he leaves everything. He leaves his livelihood, everything that he had known up until that point, literally drops his nets and goes to follow Jesus. But this is interesting when you start to compare him. Peter was very outspoken. Peter, you actually see a lot of times when Jesus is talking to the disciples and he's asking them questions, Peter becomes the person that kind of answers for the group significant amount of time. Some of that probably was because he was probably one of the older disciples, but also that strength, that fearlessness. He's actually the first one that calls Jesus the Messiah out of them. And it's that kind of boldness that we get used to with Peter. But then it's so funny because you have Peter, this very like, I almost would say like a type A personality. And then you get to Andrew and you're like, related, how? Like, Andrew still probably would have been jacked. There was some definitely fearlessness within Andrew, but Andrew was like super meek. We don't actually get a lot about Andrew. Andrew's mentioned like being a lot of places, but not saying or doing much in those places.
He might have been a middle child.
He definitely might have been a middle child. I feel like there was a disciple that was going to get left behind. Like, they go up there for the transfiguration, and Andrew was like, oh, like, whatever. He got left. So be it. Like, they didn't even notice Andrew wasn't there until they got to the top. And they're like, it doesn't matter that much. He'll be fine. He'll fend for himself. But I do feel like that's what Andrew was. Like, he just was a meek person. And so there was a really cool, I can't remember who said it, but he doesn't perform any like huge miracles. Mm-hmm. He doesn't get to see any of these kind of crazy things, but he had an incredible amount of faith. He's actually, because he was originally a disciple of John, so John the Baptist. And he overhears John referring to Jesus as the Lamb of God. And so he begins to get this idea in his head that, okay, like Jesus might be the Messiah, and ends up bringing Peter along in this journey to decide that like they are with Jesus now 24/7, 365. This isn't just a passive following of Jesus, but a committed following of Jesus. Andrew ends up pulling his brother. Andrew was a seeker. Yeah. He was seeking the Messiah. He was waiting for the first opportunity. And when he finally gets it, it's not like, John really had to spell it out for him. John was just like, oh, it's the Lamb of God. And like Andrew just kind of overheard it. Yep. And Andrew's like, okay, cool, boom, Messiah, let's go. Like, he was just so ready and so willing to jump in. And I think, like, Andrew, like a somewhat comparison to what today, like, you have, like, your pastors, your teachers, your preachers, those people that are up on stage. Andrew never would have been one of those. Mm-hmm. But he was that person that's sitting there in the congregation every single week, that's supporting you, that's loving on you, that when you need some help setting up some tables or chairs, he's the first one in and the last one gone. When you need somebody to talk to, he was there. Like, that was Andrew. And this, he doesn't pull off any of these crazy miracles or things like that. But it was miraculous enough for him to have as much faith as he did to follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. In that time, with what it meant to follow Jesus, with death imminent because of following him, he still had the faith, and that faith in and of itself was miraculous. Yeah. Anything else to add on?
Yeah, so one thing that kind of catches people off guard when they're reading the Bible, not totally understanding a lot of the context of it, is that when Jesus is calling these disciples and he just says, come follow me, they end up leaving whatever it is they're doing and just upping and going with him. And we read that with our 21st century eyes and we're like, what is going on here? But you have to understand, in that context, being a disciple of anybody or anything was very much a shifting kind of process. The only person in that group, in the bunch of the disciples that Jesus called, who would have had less ability to change careers basically at any time would have been Peter, because he was so much older, because he already had a family. But everybody else, all the other disciples who were so much younger, we believe somewhere between like 12 and 20-ish, all of them who were not established in their careers, who didn't have families yet, they would have had, every ability to just drop what they were doing in their current trade, whether that be fishermen or whatever else, and follow Jesus. But for Peter, that was actually a lot more risky. He had a lot more to lose by doing that if it didn't work out. And yet he doesn't ever question it. He immediately drops his nets, he gets out of his boat, and he goes and follows Jesus.
Yeah, the difference between Andrew and Peter, and I think it's some of the reason why Andrew is kind of pulling Peter along at first, is because of that. Is because Andrew ultimately understands, like, for him, there's nothing to lose.
Yeah.
And Peter's having to go, man, there's going to be less time with my family. It's going to be harder to take care of them. I don't know if I'm going to be able to take care of them. And all these different things. And ultimately what he finds later on, especially when you have this whole miraculous miracle where we actually get the fact that that Peter was married, because his mother-in-law ends up getting healed, and all those things, this miraculous sign happens because Jesus ultimately was going to not just take care of Peter, but his family. And it's this cool reminder of, like, Jesus doesn't want to just take care of you. Mm-hmm. Like, he wants to take care of those around you, and a lot of times the way he'll do that is through you. Which is a really cool thing. But then we have one more character we got to get into. Mm-hmm. And that's Matthew. So Matthew, the tax collector.
Yeah. So back in our first episode, our pilot, if you will, we went into a little bit of the history of the intertestamental period, and we got into a little bit of the different groups that kind of emerged from that time period of oppression, of foreign occupation. And there were actually more than just those three. Those were just kind of the main three that Jesus interacts with the most during his ministry and life on earth. But another one that's really important is this group called the Herodians. So remember when we talked about the Sadducees, how they were willing to compromise the law, they were willing to compromise a lot of what the Jews considered to be their identity. They were willing to compromise those things in order to get what they wanted, and in order to get the benefits and the rights of the Roman government and what Rome could offer them. But the Sadducees were Levites, so they were descendants of Levi. They were Levitical priests. But there was also another group of the Israelites who kind of followed in the Sadducees' footsteps, except the difference was they were not of the Levitical line. So the people who were not Levites, not priests, but had kind of the same viewpoint of the Sadducees in that the law could be shirked, basically, in order to get what we want from the Roman government. Those people were called Herodians, and they were seen as just the absolute worst offenders of basically being traitors, because they literally would get jobs from the Romans. So, like Matthew being a tax collector, he worked for the Romans. The Romans paid him to tax the Jewish people on their way into different cities, sometimes on their way like into the temple and those kinds of things. And so the Jewish people just hated the Herodians and these other groups of Israelites who were known as Herodians, because they just saw them as traitors to the Jewish faith and willing to compromise pretty much anything for a paycheck and some rights from the Roman government. And so Matthew was also in that group of just kind of an outcast, not really popular. Nobody liked him. Nobody wanted to hang out with him. And so it's very interesting that Jesus really goes out of his way to find him and to call him to be his disciple. And he's not only offering Matthew like a way back into, the Jewish community, but he's offering him, a community in general. He's offering him a chance to no longer be ostracized from his own people. And so there's no wonder he jumped at that.
Well, he offered him a prominent position at that.
Yeah.
Like there was like an honor when you decide to follow somebody, when you decide to be a disciple of somebody, like that was an honoring position.
Yeah.
And that wasn't any position that he was going to get as a Herodian working for the Roman government. Wasn't going to be an honoring position amongst his people. It may have been amongst the Romans, but it was a completely different structure. And I know there's been decisions that I've made in my life where I get on the other end of it and I go, man, I hurt people and I regret it. Like, the grass looked greener when I was over here, and then I got over there and I realized, no, it really wasn't. And so I think ultimately Matthew's probably a good example of this. He gets over there, he gets all these benefits, he gets all the bennies, right? He gets to be a Roman citizen. He gets to get a paycheck, a big, substantial paycheck from them, on top of the fact that, like, honestly, if he wants more money, he can just steal.
Yeah,
like within the taxes.
Steal from
that was legal. That was permissible. That was almost encouraged.
Yeah.
And I think he gets on the other side of this, and it's a very long, because here's the thing, like, the Romans, while they would support them, they weren't like their friends. It wasn't like they were hanging out. Like, they were still looked down upon within that community. And so their options would be they were now the lowest in both the Jewish, like their original community, and in the Roman community, because they weren't, original Roman citizens. Mm-hmm. And so what Jesus is offering him is a prominent position within his old culture.
Yep.
And so he, drops what he was doing to go do that, like, runs away, ready to do this. But it is interesting to see, and you can start to see it here, and you'll continue to see it as we go through all 12 of them, that Jesus is calling outcasts. Mm-hmm. He didn't come and ask kings to join his team, or really rich people, or centurions, or he's starting to take the lowest in all of the people groups, specifically the Jewish group, or even though, because no Jew would have considered Matthew Jewish, really, at that point in time. They would have said a Herodian, which basically was its own people group as far as the Jewish people were concerned.
It was a Jewish traitor.
It's the same thing, and we'll have to do a whole other series on Samaritans and Gentiles, and what do those words actually mean and things like that. They were seen as completely different people groups, even if they had Hebrew blood. And so for Matthew, in his particular context, he very much, blood-wise, would have had every right to be a Hebrew citizen, but he gave it up to go be a tax collector. And then was literally given that second chance by Jesus.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. But here's the thing, and we'll get it as it goes farther on, as people begin to question Jesus on why he's hanging out with these people, is that even though Jesus says, hey, come back to the Jewish community, but doesn't mean that the Jewish community is like, hey, we now love Matthew because he's not a tax collector. Unfortunately, his past still follows him, and this is true of a lot of the disciples, that ultimately their pasts still follow them, but to see how they eventually later on kind of overcome that and really are a new creation in Jesus is really, really cool. So to see Simon, our strong, brave, passionate fisherman, Andrew, our strong, brave, meek, barely talks, but the miracle of just faith and jumping at it, and then getting Matthew, who's really just the second chance story of a Herodian, of this person exiled from society that is just starting to make his way back in. And you can tell, as Matthew's right, he's cherishing every single moment along the way. And you can read it in his gospel, that he really is cherishing every single moment because he is seeing this opportunity to come back into Jewish society and to be part of something so big that he had no right to be. And people believed that. Yeah. I'm sure he was told that every single day. And so you can just see his reverence and gratefulness for the second chance that Jesus had given him to be a part of something so great. Because all of the Jewish people would have said, well, the Herodians aren't part of this covenant with the Messiah. And he ends up being one of the closest 12.
Yep.
So super cool. Well, that's it for this episode.
Oh, wow.
That's it. Pretty quick episode. The hope of these is to be pretty quick. Come back for the next one, and we'll get into the next 3. See ya.